The air in the squad car was thick with the scent of stale coffee and unsaid words. Detective Elias Thorne, a man whose face held the permanent fatigue of someone who'd seen too much night, gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make his knuckles white. Beside him, Detective Sarah Reyes, sharper and newer to the homicide division, checked the charge on her sidearm. "You been out to the Whisperwood before, Thorne?" she asked, her voice a low, even murmur that didn't break the tension. Thorne shook his head, the movement tired. "Not on a call. People don't go missing in Whisperwood, Reyes. They just disappear." The Whisperwood National Forest bordered the affluent outskirts of the city, hundreds of miles of untamed, densely packed pines and old-growth timber, renowned for its oppressive silence. No cell service. No clear trails past the first-mile markers. A perfect place to lose anything, or anyone. The case was textbook missing persons. Wealthy college student, Sarah Jenkins, 19, last seen 3 nights ago leaving a party on the edge of the woods. Her car was found this morning, keys in the ignition, doors locked, parked neatly on an unpaved service road a mile into the forest's boundary. They pulled up to the perimeter tape. 2 patrol officers, faces pale and eyes wide, stood guard. Officer Dalton, the younger of the 2, stepped forward, swallowing hard. "Detectives. There's nothing, sir. No signs of struggle. Not a single boot print that doesn't belong to a search party member." Thorne nodded, stepping over the tape. "Show us the vehicle." The car, a pristine black SUV, looked unnervingly normal against the backdrop of the massive, indifferent trees. Thorne ran a gloved hand over the driver's side door. Locked, just as Dalton reported. "She locked her car," Reyes observed, circling the vehicle. "If she was in trouble, or dragged out, why lock the door? If she went willingly, why leave the keys?" Thorne countered, peering through the tinted window. Then, Reyes pointed. On the passenger seat, resting casually on the black leather, was a small, ornate wooden box. It was a dark, polished wood, antique, maybe 7 inches long, with intricate, silver inlay that resembled twisting, leafless branches. It looked completely out of place, like an artifact dropped from another time. Thorne radioed for a forensic team to process the vehicle and retrieve the box, but something about the stillness of the woods, the way the ancient pines seemed to lean in, pressed against his training. He knew the protocol, yet an insistent, irrational chill slid down his spine. "This is all wrong," Thorne muttered. "It's too clean. It's like the scene was set." Reyes knelt beside the rear tire, her eyes tracing a faint, almost invisible mark in the soft dirt just outside the passenger door. It wasn't a print. It was a score, a deep, thin line, about 3 feet long, that cut through the loose topsoil. "Look, detective," she said, pointing to the line. "It's not a footprint. It looks like something was dragged out of the passenger side and across this spot, something heavy, but not on its feet." Thorne crouched down, examining the mark. He followed it with his gaze, past the tire, where the score abruptly stopped at the edge of the deeper woods. There, a small patch of ferns was bent unnaturally low, not crushed, but tilted towards the darkness of the trees. Then, he saw it. Stuck to one of the bent fern fronds, a single, silver strand. It looked like a lock of hair, but when Thorne carefully plucked it with tweezers and held it up to the weak afternoon sun, it wasn't hair. It was a single, impossibly fine strand of the same dark silver as the inlay on the box in the car. It felt strangely cold to the touch, and shimmered with a dull, unsettling luster. Reyes noticed the box's silver inlay again, then the strange silver strand on the fern, then the drag mark disappearing into the silent forest. Her gaze fixed on the spot where the undergrowth was tilted. "Whatever was dragged," Reyes whispered, her composure finally cracking, "it was coming from the car, not going toward it." Thorne looked from the silver strand, to the empty woods, to the locked car with its mysterious offering on the passenger seat. The forest, which had been merely quiet, now felt like it was listening. "This isn't a simple case, Reyes," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, professional monotone that masked the sudden dread. "We're not looking for a body. We're looking for a door." The forensic team, led by a tired but meticulous technician named Marcus, finally managed to pry the ornate wooden box from the locked SUV. Clean as a whistle, Thorne, Marcus reported, holding up a clear evidence bag containing the dark wooden relic. No prints on the outside except maybe a partial smudge from the victim, Sarah Jenkins. But the wood is old, heavily varnished. Wipes prints clean. Reyes, standing beside Thorne, pointed to the faint silver inlay on the box. What about the metal, Marcus? Any match to the fiber we found? Marcus looked at the minuscule, shimmering silver thread Thorne had bagged. Different composition, Detective. The inlay on the box is an antique silver tin alloy. The fiber, it's almost pure silver, abnormally fine. More like spun wire than a natural strand. We'll have to send it for spectroscopy, but it feels wrong. Too dense for its size. As the SUV was towed, Thorne took the box to a makeshift command post set up near the forest line. The object felt heavy, cold, and curiously hollow. He ran his gloved thumb over the lid. The silver inlay wasn't decorative scrollwork, it was a complex, interlocking pattern that almost resembled a highly stylized, impossible map. Reyes, look at this, Thorne said, tracing the pattern. It's not random. See how these lines meet? They mirror the aerial grid of the Whisperwood itself. He pulled out a laminated map of the national forest, overlaid with search quadrants. The forest was noted for 3 distinct, concentric rings of geological strata. Thorne placed the box beside the map. The lines on the box, Reyes confirmed, her eyes widening in recognition. The innermost circle, the deepest part of the forest, it has a pattern that's far denser, more chaotic. Like the trails suddenly cease. The outside ring, where we are now, is simpler. Thorne used a penlight. And right here, he pointed to a specific nexus of 3 twisting silver branches on the box. This spot corresponds exactly with the location of Sarah Jenkins's locked car. The box wasn't an offering, it was a key, or a marker. They drove further into the woods, following the barely visible service road, guided by the internal compass of the box's strange geography. The temperature dropped perceptibly, and the silence of the Whisperwood became less about a lack of sound and more about an oppressive presence that absorbed it. After a few miles, the road ended abruptly at a massive wall of old-growth trees. It was here, exactly where the dense, innermost lines of the box's silver map converged, that they found the second vehicle. It was a rusted, decades-old sedan, practically swallowed by the undergrowth, half hidden behind a curtain of thick ivy. It hadn't been reported missing in years. The license plate was so encrusted with grime it was unreadable. Thorne approached cautiously. The sedan's doors were unlocked. The interior was dust-choked and smelled of mildew and something else, a faint, metallic odor, like old blood and ozone. Reyes recoiled. Thorne, this is too old. What does this have to do with Sarah Jenkins? Thorne opened the glove compartment. Inside, protected by a tattered plastic sleeve, was a driver's license. The picture showed a young man, smiling widely, his features dated by the late 1980s haircut. Name, Daniel Reed. Missing persons report filed 35 years ago. Case went cold within a month. He was 19, like Sarah Jenkins, a student from the same wealthy neighborhood, last seen on the edge of the Whisperwood. On the passenger seat, not covered by dust, placed neatly on a shredded, sun-bleached seat cushion, was another item. It was a single, silver object. Not a box this time, but a small, heavy silver bell, tarnished with age, no larger than a fist. It had the same intricate, leafless branch carvings as the inlay on Sarah's box. Thorne picked it up. It was freezing cold. As he turned it over, his flashlight beam caught something etched into the interior rim of the bell's mouth, a single, tiny letter, R. Reyes was already checking the back seat. She found it instantly, a long, deep score mark in the thick dust of the rear windshield, not a scratch, but a deliberate inscription. It was a series of symbols that looked nothing like English, sharp, angular lines, almost runes, repeating in a disturbing pattern. This man, Reed, he was here, Reyes whispered, her hand hovering near the symbols. He was alive long enough to write this. Thorne looked from the bell to the etchings, to the forest that had now yielded two impossible objects from two separate missing persons cases, spanning 3 decades. "No, Reyes," Thorne said, his voice flat with rising horror. "He wasn't writing to us. He was writing about what took him. And now, Sarah Jenkins has delivered the invitation." Thorne and Reyes returned to the command post, carrying the silver bell and the photograph of Daniel Reed. The forest felt even colder now, as if the discovery of the old sedan had somehow angered it. The silver bell was placed next to the wooden box. Both items featured the same disturbing, leafless branch carvings. The box was Sarah Jenkins's, the bell was Daniel Reed's. 2 victims, 35 years apart, leaving behind artifacts that were clearly linked. "We need to know what that etching means," Thorne said, leaning over the photo of the inscribed rear windshield. The symbols were complex, angular, and seemed to combine into phrases or perhaps a script. Reyes had already consulted with a linguistics expert remotely. The results were chillingly vague. The expert says they are unlike any known Earth script, but bear a structural resemblance to certain archaic pictographs used for funerary rites, specifically those found in isolated, pre-human settlements in northern Europe, concepts dealing with binding and silence. Thorne stared at the symbols. Binding. Silence. And the invitation. He looked at the wooden box. The pattern on its lid, the silver map, was now the only tangible lead. He used his field camera to take a high-resolution image of the box's silver inlay and projected it onto a large screen, overlaying it on the topographic map of the Whisperwood. The location of the Jenkins car, point A. The location of Reed's car, point B, Thorne narrated, circling the 2 points on the map. They were connected by a faint, straight line in the box's silver pattern, a line that ran directly beneath the dense, inaccessible center of the forest. That he traced another line on the projected image, a prominent, heavier silver branch that curled out from point B. If this map shows the path of the disappearances, where does Daniel Reed's line lead? The line terminated abruptly at a large, shaded area on the topographic map, a shallow depression that the National Forest Service had marked simply as unsurveyed wetland. Locals called it the Black Basin. It was a massive, swampy area known for quicksand and dangerously thick fog. "That's 7 miles from the nearest road," Thorne, Reyes said, her finger tapping the Black Basin. "A patrol officer would sink a mile in. And why would a college kid drive 7 miles into a swamp and just stop?" "He didn't drive, Reyes. The line on the box is not a road. It's a path for something that doesn't need a road," Thorne corrected, a grim certainty hardening his voice. "And he didn't stop. He was led." Thorne picked up the silver bell, and Reyes handled the wooden box. As they stood next to the projected map, holding the objects, a strange phenomenon occurred. The small, pure silver fiber they had found on the fern, which had been taped to the map for reference, suddenly began to vibrate. It wasn't just shaking, it was slowly, almost impossibly, rotating. As the line on the projected map moved closer to the Black Basin, the silver fiber began to point directly at the screen, toward the location marked as the termination point. "It's reacting to the objects," Reyes breathed, stepping back. "Like a compass needle." Thorne placed the box and the bell side by side on the table. The vibrations in the silver fiber stopped. He then moved the 2 objects apart by about 6 inches. The silver fiber started vibrating again, weakly, pointing vaguely into the trees. "The box is the invitation. The bell is the mark of what has been taken," Thorne theorized. "And the map shows us where the next ceremony is meant to take place." He pointed to the junction where the silver lines of the box terminated in the Black Basin. He was about to suggest a search party for the morning when he noticed a small, almost imperceptible detail on the map at that exact convergence point, a tiny, cross-hatched square, smaller than a thumbnail, invisible until the high-resolution projection. It was too small to be a known structure. It was completely surrounded by the dense lines of the chaotic inner circle of the silver pattern. Thorne zoomed the camera projection in until the tiny square filled the screen. It wasn't a structure. It was a door. A small, square aperture, drawn in perspective, showing an opening in the ground, leading into darkness. And above the door, etched so faintly it was barely visible, were 3 of the same angular, alien symbols Daniel Reed had scratched onto his car window decades earlier. The meaning was suddenly, terribly clear. The case wasn't just about a missing person, it was about an ongoing, recurrent event in the heart of the Whisperwood. The forest was not quiet because there was nothing there. It was quiet because everything was buried and waiting. "Reyes," Thorne said, grabbing his jacket and sidearm. "We're done waiting for forensics. If that silver fiber points to the Black Basin, we go now. Sarah Jenkins might still be there, and if she left that box, she was trying to tell us where the library is." "Library?" "The place where the silence is kept. The place where Daniel Reed wrote those symbols. It's what those symbols mean, the silent repository." The sun was a mere, bruised memory of light by the time Thorne and Reyes ditched the patrol car and mounted a battered, four-wheel drive ATV. They had no time to wait for a heavily equipped tactical team. Every minute Sarah Jenkins was missing deepened the dread that this was not a hostage situation, but a ritualistic countdown. Thorne drove, relying on the single-speed, all-terrain vehicle to churn through the increasingly muddy ground. Reyes held the clipboard. The wooden box and the silver bell were secured to it, 6 inches apart, providing the necessary distance for the silver fiber, their impossibly accurate compass, to quiver and point the way. The deeper they plunged, the thicker the Whisperwood became, evolving from a pine forest into a hostile, primordial tangle of cypress and black willow. The air grew immediately heavier, laden with the metallic scent of standing water and decaying leaves, yet unnervingly cold. "It's suppressing the sound," Reyes shouted over the engine's roar. "Listen. The ambient noise, it's gone. No crickets, no birds. Just us." Thorne nodded, his eyes fixed on the vibrating silver needle. It led them off the barely there deer trails, through thorny thickets, and finally, into the infamous Black Basin. The basin was worse than its reputation. It wasn't a swamp in the Louisiana sense, it was a flat, shallow sea of pitch-black, motionless water surrounded by skeletal trees that seemed stripped of life by some invisible blight. A thick, icy mist clung waist-high to the ground, reflecting the single, narrow beam of their ATV headlight in distorted, dancing shadows. Thorne cut the engine. The resulting silence was absolute, a physical pressure that felt hostile to human breath. The silver fiber, which had been vibrating furiously, suddenly stilled. It now pointed straight down, its sharp tip aimed directly at the black water a few feet ahead of the ATV. "We're here," Thorne whispered, pulling his gloves tighter. They waded cautiously into the shallow water, flashlights cutting through the suffocating fog. The floor of the basin was surprisingly solid here, a layer of slick, dense peat over firm ground. Reyes stopped abruptly, shining her light on a cluster of thick, ropey vines woven together with unnerving precision. "Look how these are growing," she said. "They're braided, intentionally. Like a curtain." Thorne pushed the vines aside. Beyond them, nestled in a small, dry clearing that should have been submerged, was the impossible structure predicted by the silver map. It was a perfect, 5-foot square hatch, set flat into the earth. It wasn't metal or wood, but a dark, porous stone or concrete, completely covered in black, ancient moss that seemed to suck the light in. The object was utterly alien to the wilderness, too precise, too geometric, too enduring. It looked less like a bunker and more like a massive, forgotten tombstone. Thorne scraped away the moss with his boot, revealing the stark, dark surface beneath. His flashlight beam played over the exposed stone. It was covered in the angular, alien script, the same symbols Daniel Reed had scratched into his car window 35 years prior. This was the silent repository. "This thing wasn't built," Reyes breathed, her voice trembling slightly. "It looks like it grew here. It's been waiting." Thorne knelt, his heart hammering a rapid, unsteady rhythm against his ribs. The center of the hatch bore a circular depression, but it wasn't a handle. In the center of the circle was a small, cruciform aperture, a keyhole shaped like an inverted cross, or perhaps a complex, multi-bladed symbol. He looked at the 2 artifacts in his hand. The antique wooden box was too large. But the small, heavy silver bell from Daniel Reed's car, the one with the single R etched inside, had a short, stylized loop where the clapper would have been secured, a loop of pure, dense silver. Thorne lifted the silver bell. He held it above the strange, cruciform keyhole, and without thinking, realized the terrifying truth of the case. "This bell," he muttered, "it wasn't a marker. It's the key. Daniel Reed wasn't taken from here, Reyes. He was taken into this place, and they made him leave his key behind." As he moved the bell closer to the hatch, the static silence of the black basin finally broke. A sound, faint but clear, drifted up from beneath the earth. It was a high-pitched, desperate sound, like a woman weeping, the sound of Sarah Jenkins. The sound of Sarah Jenkins's weeping, raw and desperate, was the only motivation Thorn needed. It cut through the paralyzing dread, giving way to a fierce, protective urgency. "Cover me, Reyes," Thorn ordered, his voice tight. He held the silver bell, its stylized loop fitting perfectly into the cruciform aperture in the stone hatch that he didn't need to turn or twist a handle. As his hand closed around the loop, the metal felt unnaturally cold, instantly drawing heat from his glove. He simply pushed the bell inwards. There was no mechanical click, no grind of ancient gears, just a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate through the very ground they stood on. The weeping stopped. Absolute, suffocating silence returned. Then, the 5-foot square hatch began to move. It didn't swing open, it descended, slowly and smoothly, like a piston sinking into thick oil. The surrounding soil shifted slightly, but the square remained perfectly framed, revealing a black, square void beneath. A burst of air rose from the depths, air that was frigid, stagnant, and carried the heavy smell of dust, limestone, and something faintly acrid, like burnt copper. Thorn pulled the silver bell back. The hatch, now fully retracted, revealed a shaft of absolute darkness. He shined his flashlight down. The beam was swallowed instantly, but its light caught the slick, geometric walls of the shaft. A narrow, winding staircase of the same dark, foreign stone spiraled down into the earth. There was no railing, just a perilous, dizzying drop. "We have to go down, Thorn." "Now," Reyes said, her pistol already drawn and pointed into the void. Thorn paused, placing the silver bell carefully on the stone lip of the shaft. He needed both hands free. As the heavy bell settled, the small jolt caused the internal structure of the clapperless artifact to vibrate again. It emitted a sound. Not a melodic chime, but a single, deep, bass toll, a low, metallic gong that echoed not back at them, but down the shaft, seeming to follow the spiral staircase into the earth's core. They froze, listening. The air was dead, the sound should have been immediately absorbed, yet the toll faded slowly, traveling unnaturally far. Then, after a terrifying moment of silence, came the reply, faint, distant, and undeniably deliberate. The sound of another bell, smaller, higher-pitched, answered the toll from the unseen bottom of the shaft. It wasn't an echo. It was a call and a response. "They know we're here," Reyes whispered, her hand tightening around her weapon. "Whatever took them, it's announcing our arrival." Thorn ignored the chilling confirmation. His flashlight beam had caught something on the stone wall beside the very first step of the descent. It wasn't the ancient script. It was a fresh, hasty inscription, scratched deep into the dark stone by something sharp. It was written in English, in a frantic, spidery hand, hesitant face. "J. I saw the collector. The bell takes the breath." Sarah Jenkins had been alive. She had been here. And she had left them a warning. Thorn took the first step down the cold, alien staircase, the silver bell's resonant gong still vibrating faintly in the air around him. The silent repository was not a hiding place. It was a mechanism, and they had just started the clock. The spiral staircase seemed to defy physics, turning endlessly into the bedrock of the black basin. Thorn and Reyes descended for what felt like an hour, their flashlight beams cutting through the dense, dry cold. The air pressure became oppressive, and the only sounds were the rasp of their breathing and the ceaseless, unsettling rhythm of water dripping somewhere far, far below. The entire shaft was carved from the same dark, foreign stone. The angular script Daniel Reed had scrawled was etched deeply into every available surface, forming looping, claustrophobic patterns that seemed to ripple and shift in their peripheral vision. They moved like ghosts in a crypt. Finally, the shaft ended. The narrow passage opened abruptly into a vast, subterranean cavern. Thorn swept his light across the space. It was a circular chamber, huge and unervingly symmetrical. The walls were not carved stone, but densely packed, smooth clay, riddled with thousands of perfectly aligned, small, square alcoves or niches, covering the surface from the floor to the unseen ceiling. This was the silent repository. This was the library. It's a storage facility, Reyes whispered, her voice bouncing strangely in the immense, silent space, but it wasn't storing books. Each niche held a single, small, shimmering object. Thorn approached the nearest wall. The niches were filled with silver. Small, personal effects, a tarnished silver wedding ring, a delicate silver thimble, a tiny, antique silver baby shoe, a simple silver cufflink. Every object bore the same intricate, leafless branch carving found on Sarah Jenkins's box and Daniel Reed's bell. Beside each niche, etched into the clay, was a name's initial and a date. Dr. 1988. AL 1963. MB 2001. Missing persons, Thorn breathed, his stomach twisting. This isn't a random collection. These are trophies. Each one represents a life taken from the Whisperwood over decades, maybe centuries. The silver bell hadn't been a key left by Daniel Reed. It had been his ceremonial payment, left at the access point, while the collector took a small, personal piece, a tiny bell, perhaps from a keychain, for the library. They moved quickly around the circumference of the chamber, flashlights darting over the terrifying catalog of the missing. Reyes stopped, shining her light on a section of the wall near what looked like a rough-hewn work surface. Thorn. Look. In a niche slightly larger and positioned slightly higher than the others, sat a freshly placed artifact. It was a tiny, elegant silver locket, engraved with a delicate S. Beside it, etched into the damp clay, SJ 2023. Sarah Jenkins's personal token was already on the shelf. They were too late, but then, Reyes's light shifted to the work surface itself, a long, flat table made of dark, unidentifiable wood. On it sat the small, high-pitched silver bell that had answered their toll. Beside it were several objects, wickedly sharp, archaic surgical tools that looked like they were designed for delicate, terrible work, a small, leather-bound journal, and a pile of thick, crimson-soaked gauze. The blood was still wet. She was here, Reyes said, her voice a cracked sound of horror. She was just here. That's why the weeping stopped. She was moved. Thorn picked up the journal. The cover was bound in old, supple human skin. He opened it to a random page. It was filled with the angular script, but interspersed between the glyphs were detailed, anatomical drawings of the human larynx and respiratory system. Then, he noticed the final, terrifying detail on the work table. Next to the blood-soaked gauze and the instruments, there was a single, small, empty alcove carved into the wood, and leaning against the back of that empty alcove, waiting to be used, was a tiny, intricately carved silver clapper. Thorn realized what the warning, "The bell takes the breath," meant, and why the bells in the library were silent. The collector wasn't taking lives, it was taking something much more specific. "They aren't missing persons, Reyes," Thorn whispered, dropping the hideous journal. "They are a collection of voices. And whatever Sarah Jenkins still has, the collector is about to harvest it." The fresh scent of blood and the looming terror of the collector's macabre collection spurred Thorn and Reyes into motion. They swept the perimeter of the circular chamber, but there were no other doors, no clear passages, only the silent, endless walls of shelved silver tokens. "She's not here." "She was moved," Reyes stated, reloading her clip with shaking hands. "She must have been here when we tolled the bell. That gave them time." Thorn was focused on the work table, now fully illuminated by his light. He looked again at the empty alcove carved into the wood. The high-pitched silver bell sat ready, its twin, the small silver clapper, resting beside it. "The bell is incomplete," Thorn murmured, his eyes fixed on the items. "The collector is preparing the final stage. The bell is the container, the clapper, I think, is the thing they use to contain the voice." He looked at the blood-soaked gauze and the archaic tools. The collector was not merely a killer, it was a surgeon, a practitioner of a horrific, occult science. As Reyes checked the dark floor for any sign of a struggle, her flashlight caught an anomaly in the fine, dry dust near the edge of the chamber. "Footprint, Thorn," she hissed, pointing. "But it's wrong. It was a large, heavy depression, clearly defined. It showed 5 long toes and a distinct heel, but the entire impression was inverted. The toes pointed toward the wall of the chamber, yet the heel implied the person had been walking away from it. It was the print of something that walked backwards, or had feet that were fundamentally, terrifyingly wrong. The realization sent a paralyzing wave of cold through Thorn. Whatever the collector was, it was not human. He grabbed the small, skin-bound journal again, ignoring the revulsion. He flipped through the pages of anatomical sketches and angular symbols until he reached a section marked by a dried, dark smudge. It was a diagram illustrating the human ear, but instead of the normal auditory canals, the drawing showed a complex, spiraling network ending in a single, minuscule silver wire. The subject is calmed by the silence, the ancient script on the page seemed to suggest. The offering is given to open the path. The wire tracks the echo. The breath is contained by the toll. The offering. That was the original wooden box Sarah Jenkins left in her car. It wasn't just a key or a map, it was the payment required to open the path into the repository. The collector is hunting by sound, Reyes, Thorn realized. It tracks the echo. Our bell, the one we tolled, led it to Sarah. And now it knows we're here. He stepped onto the work table, looking up into the darkness above the shelves, searching for a sign of movement. The ceiling was lost in shadows, but high up, near where the packed clay wall met the sheer bedrock of the cavern, he saw a narrow, irregular gap, a tunnel that twisted away into the darkness. It was too small for a man to walk upright, but large enough for something to crawl through, and sticking to the rough clay edge of that gap, he saw a single, dark smear, a metallic residue left behind by something dragging past. It was the same composition, cold, dense, pure silver. The same metal as the fiber found on the fern and the one drawn in the collector's macabre diagram. That's the exit, Thorn said, dropping off the table. That silver trace, she was dragged through there. She's not deep below. She's being moved horizontally, through a network of tunnels. He looked back at the empty alcove on the work table, then at the inverted footprint in the dust. The collector was not a static entity, it was mobile, unnatural, and was currently moving its captive, keeping Sarah silent until the very moment of the final harvest. We go through the wall, Reyes. Now. But from here on, we do not make a sound, Thorn commanded, holstering his weapon and switching his flashlight to a dim, hooded beam. We are in the collector's hunting grounds. Climbing into the narrow passage required a desperate, silent scramble. Thorn went first, his massive frame scraping against the cold, rough clay and bedrock. Reyes followed immediately, relying on the muted beam of her hooded flashlight. The tunnel was barely wide enough for one person to crawl. It twisted and turned, suffocating them with immediate, absolute claustrophobia. The smell of dust, ozone, and wet metal hung heavy, guiding them along the faint, dark silver smear that marked the collector's trail. The silence they aimed for was impossible. Every rustle of their gear, every shift of their weight, every ragged inhale, was amplified by the close, acoustic confines of the passage, echoing back at them like an explosion. After what felt like an eternity of crawling, Thorn halted, his ear pressed against the stone. "Hear that?" he whispered, his voice sounding deafeningly loud. It was not a distinct sound, but a subtle, pervasive auditory hallucination, a mass of faint, low whispers that seemed to emanate directly from the stone walls themselves. They sounded like 100 voices speaking at once, indistinguishable, yet entirely unnerving. Reyes listened, her face pale in the faint light. "It's the repository, Thorn. The collection. We're crawling through there," echoes. As they continued, they started noticing the physical manifestation of the collector's passage, the whisper tracks. The floor of the tunnel was deeply carved in sections, worn smooth not by water, but by repeated use. In places, the stone was buffed to a slick polish where the unnatural, inverted feet of the entity had been dragged over countless years. They reached a small, damp alcove that allowed them to crouch momentarily. Thorn shined his light higher, and saw the silver smear again, this time on the ceiling of the alcove. He reached up and carefully touched the residue. It was cold, thick, and viscous. It was not just a trace left by the captive's clothing. The silver was a secretion, a bodily substance the collector left behind. And it was still wet. It just passed here, Thorn hissed, wiping the chilling substance on his tactical pants. It's not far ahead. Reyes, hunched over, froze. Her eyes were wide, staring into the dark tunnel behind them, the one they had just exited. The whispering in the walls suddenly intensified, becoming clearer, sharper. They could almost distinguish words: Jenkins. Reed. Thorn. Then, the auditory terror was replaced by a solid, physical sound that it was a slow, heavy, dragging noise, distinct from the stone-on-stone scrape of their own movements. It was the sound of something immensely heavy being pulled across the rough floor, punctuated by the rhythmic, deliberate scrape of the collector's inverted heels that it was coming from behind them. The collector hadn't moved Sarah Jenkins out through the winding passage ahead. It had circled back through a parallel, unseen tunnel network and was now closing the escape route, sealing them inside its lair. Thorn pulled his sidearm, but firing meant a deafening roar in the small space, an invitation to the horror that was hunting them by sound. Silent retreat, Thorn commanded, his breath catching in his throat. We moved backwards, fast. And pray this thing is slow. The sound of the heavy, dragging object and the scraping of the inverted feet were now horribly close, amplified by the stone corridor into a terrifying, rhythmic percussion. The collector was not slow, it was moving with terrifying, deliberate speed, blocking their only escape. Thorn and Reyes scrambled backward, pulling themselves along the whisper tracks, their hearts hammering against the stone floor. They had to maintain silence, but every muscle was screaming with the effort. Reyes, leading the backwards retreat, risked a quick, minute adjustment of her flashlight beam. In the brief flash of hooded light, she saw it. The tunnel was almost completely filled by a massive, hunched silhouette. It was dark, angular, and draped in what looked like heavy, black cloth or solidified moss. She couldn't make out the head or limbs, but she clearly saw the source of the sound, a thick, ancient silver chain, its links tarnished black, stretching out from the unseen body and scraping along the stone floor. It was the chain, not the feet, that created the terrifying metallic symphony. The collector was chained, perhaps to limit its movement or to allow it to track its victims by sound. Faster, Reyes. Thorn whispered fiercely from behind her. He knew the inverted feet meant the entity was moving at full speed backwards down the tunnel while maintaining a terrifying focus on the entry point ahead. The scraping sound was right on the bend, just 10 feet behind them. They wouldn't make it to the library entrance in time. Thorn made a split-second, desperate decision that violated every rule he had just laid down. That he reached into his pack and pulled out a heavy, standard-issue tactical flashlight, the metal-cased kind, loud and durable. He pulled the pin, took aim at the far wall just beyond the tunnel bend where the collector was about to emerge, and threw it with all his might. The impact was deafening. The clang of metal on rock was an explosion in the confined space, followed by the blinding flash of the shattered light. The scraping sound stopped immediately. The pervasive whispering in the walls ceased. The world plunged into an absolute, ringing silence that was even more terrifying than the noise. For one agonizing second, they were completely vulnerable. Then, from the darkness where the collector lurked, came a sound that ripped through the silence, not a roar of rage, but a high-pitched, thin, metallic shriek, like rusty steel tearing against itself, or perhaps, like tortured, screaming silver. The sound was not organic, it was the sound of its own mechanisms failing or reacting violently to the sudden, overwhelming noise. The distraction bought them 4 precious seconds. Go! Thorn yelled, ignoring the pain in his knees. They lunged into the final, vertical climb that dropped back into the library chamber. They slipped and fell the last few feet onto the dust-covered floor. Scrambling to their feet near the work table, they had made it back to the repository. But their way out, the spiral staircase to the black basin, was now a distant, unprotected descent. And the collector was still in the tunnels, momentarily stunned, but actively hunting. Thorn looked back at the small, dark entrance in the wall. The shrieking had stopped, replaced now by a low, furious grinding noise coming from the passage. The collector was mobilizing. That he quickly scanned the work table, grabbing the single, small, silver clapper intended for Sarah Jenkins's voice. If the collector hunted by sound, perhaps they could use this artifact against it. The grinding noise from the high passage ceased, followed by a moment of absolute silence. Then, the black mass of the collector dropped from the tunnel mouth onto the work table with a jarring, non-human thud that barely made a sound in the heavy air. The entity was vast, hunched, and draped in what appeared to be heavy, black, dry moss or fungal growth that absorbed light. Its limbs were unnaturally long and jointed, ending in the grotesque, inverted feet that scuffed the wooden table. It had no discernible head, just a smooth, dark surface where a face should be. The thick, tarnished silver chain trailed from its shoulder, dragging heavily on the floor. It exuded a coldness that felt less like temperature and more like the absence of life itself. The collector saw them. It began to move across the chamber floor with unnerving speed, its gait a horrific, silent, backwards lunge. As it advanced, the air in the chamber began to press. The whispers from the clay walls, the collection of voices, intensified. They didn't sound like separate voices anymore. They merged into a single, high-frequency, paralyzing drone that pressed on their eardrums, echoing the alien script carved into the stone. This was no library. It was a resonance chamber, designed to disable prey before the final harvest. "Look!" Reyes yelled, pointing a shaking hand toward the base of the spiral staircase. Nestled in a small, final alcove they had missed during their descent, sat Sarah Jenkins. She was alive, but completely still, strapped upright to a chair made of carved bone and silver wire. Her eyes were wide and vacant, and her mouth was firmly gagged with the blood-soaked gauze they had seen on the work table. She was completely silent, prepared for the completion of the ritual. Thorn glanced from the immobilized Sarah to the oncoming collector, and then to the cluster of silver bells on the table. He remembered the diagram in the journal, the screech of tortured silver, and the power of sound in this acoustic tomb. The collector hunts with silence and paralyzes with resonance, Thorn shouted over the building drone, his voice ragged. But it's vulnerable to overwhelming, sharp noise, especially the sound of its own materials. He lunged for the work table, grabbing the small, high-pitched silver bell, the one that had answered their toll, and Daniel Reed's larger, heavy silver bell. He noticed the high-pitched bell had a small, fragile stress fracture from their tactical flashlight explosion. Thorn seized the small, dense silver clapper intended for Sarah. He didn't put it in the tiny bell, he smashed it into the massive, thick-walled cavity of Daniel Reed's bell. "Reyes! The collector!" Thorn screamed. "Shoot the small bell. Shatter it. Disrupt the drone." Reyes, already aiming, fired 3 rapid shots at the tiny, cracked silver bell on the table. The detonations in the chamber were momentarily deafening, the muzzle flash blinding, the high-pitched bell shattered into dozens of fragments, and the drone of the resonance chamber instantly fractured. The paralyzing pressure on their ears vanished. The collector paused, its massive silhouette shaking violently in the flash of the muzzle fire, the silver chain rattling fiercely. It had been temporarily blinded and shocked by the sudden, uncontrolled noise. Thorn didn't hesitate. He held Daniel Reed's heavy, thick-walled bell, now fitted with the dense silver clapper, over his head. "This is for Reed. For Jenkins. For every single voice." He swung the bell down with all his might, smashing the thick silver against the solid stone floor of the repository, aiming to unleash a catastrophic frequency into the heart of the resonance chamber. Thorn brought the heavy silver bell, now equipped with the dense clapper meant to seal Sarah Jenkins's voice, down onto the stone floor with a desperate, bone-jarring impact. The resulting sound was not a simple chime or a clang. It was a single, searing, low-frequency bass shockwave that did not travel through the air, but through the solid stone and the clay walls of the resonance chamber. It was the sound of tortured, contained power, an unleashed, primal scream amplified by the collector's own acoustic prison. The entire chamber reacted violently, the clay walls immediately spiderwebbed with cracks. The thousands of silver artifacts on the shelves, the collected tokens, began to vibrate at a catastrophic frequency, blurring into streaks of light. The ancient silver chain on the collector's body snapped under the sonic pressure, its links exploding outward. The collector, its dark mass shuddering, let out another high-pitched, silent shriek of silver. It recoiled violently, its long, metallic limbs thrashing. The sound wave, generated by its own stolen material and amplified by its own construction, was tearing the entity apart. In a final, desperate act, the collector ignored Thorn and launched its dark, amorphous form directly at the restrained Sarah Jenkins, its single remaining goal to silence the victim before the collapse. Reyes didn't hesitate. She emptied the rest of her clip into the approaching mass, aiming where she estimated its central core lay. Thorn, dropping the now shattered bell, joined her, emptying his magazine. The bullet struck the dark mass with a sickening impact. Black, metallic liquid, the collector's silver secretion, sprayed across the walls. The entity shrieked one last, agonizing, silent sound, then collapsed in on itself, rapidly decomposing into a pathetic pile of dry, black moss, shredded leather, and twisted, fragmented silver wire. The collector was dead, but the chamber was dying, too. The sonic toll had destabilized the structure. Dust and large chunks of cracked clay began raining from the high ceiling. The low-frequency rumble of the earth collapsing on itself began to drown out all other sound. Reyes! Get Sarah! Now! Thorn shouted, running toward the base of the staircase. Reyes frantically worked to sever the leather and silver wire restraints holding Sarah Jenkins. The girl was still catatonic, her eyes wide but unseeing. They managed to pull her free, Thorn supporting her slack weight. They had to get out. The long, spiral staircase was now visibly shaking, dust pouring down its center like a waterfall. We need the box. Thorn realized, looking up at the collapsing shaft. The original wooden box. It's the offering, the only thing that kept the entrance open. It's still at the top. They scrambled up the first few steps, the air thick with dust and the scent of ozone and pulverized stone. The exit was high above, and the very ground beneath them was collapsing. They had won the battle for Sarah's voice, but they were now buried alive in the collector's tomb. The sonic devastation unleashed by the final toll was consuming the repository. Thorn and Reyes hauled Sarah Jenkins up the precarious spiral staircase, their lights bouncing wildly off the cracking, inscribed walls. Chunks of dark stone broke away, tumbling into the unseen abyss below. The air pressure from the collapsing chamber drove them upward, choking them with dust. They could hear the sickening sound of the massive clay walls of the library folding in on themselves, followed by a heavy, booming thud as the roof finally gave way, sealing the collector's tomb forever. Reyes, supporting Sarah's dead weight, yelled, "The top, Thorn! Get to the top!" Thorn scrambled ahead, his hands raw. He reached the opening and saw the faint, blessed light of the black basin filtering through the icy mist. There, resting precisely on the lip of the stone shaft, was the original wooden box, the offering, the silver map. He snatched the cold, smooth box just as the stone around the opening began to violently compress. With a desperate heave, he pulled Sarah and Reyes out of the shaft and onto the relatively solid ground of the basin floor. They crawled only a few yards before the earth behind them gave a final, mournful groan. The stone hatch, or what remained of the passage, didn't rise. It collapsed inward and then, impossibly, the soil rushed in to fill the void, smoothing itself over. In seconds, the massive aperture was gone, leaving nothing but a wet, flat patch of dark soil and the eerie, cold mist. The silent repository had sealed itself, taking every shred of evidence with it. They found the ATV and drove out of the Whisperwood as the first bruised light of dawn broke over the tree line. The silence of the forest, once oppressive, was now absolute, as if the entire landscape was holding its breath. Sarah Jenkins was rushed to the nearest medical facility. Physically, she was fine, a few cuts and severe dehydration. Psychologically, she was entirely catatonic, curled inward, her eyes wide, forever fixed on something unseen. She had survived the collector, but the gag had done its work. Sarah had saved her voice from the clapper, but she could no longer use it. The silence had claimed her. The official police report, based on Thorn's fractured testimony and the lack of any physical proof beyond a few odd silver fragments, was classified as a failed kidnapping attempt by a transient cultist, a clean, bureaucratic lie that nobody in the department truly believed. The wooden box and the shattered silver bell fragments were logged into a special, high-security evidence vault under Thorn's sole custody. Weeks later, Thorn visited Sarah in the hospital. She sat by the window, motionless. As he prepared to leave, he noticed her hand, resting loosely in her lap. Clutched tightly in her palm was a single, small, black item. It wasn't a coin or a piece of jewelry. It was a fragment of the collector's remains, a tiny, twisted piece of the pure silver wire that had formed its lethal mechanism. Sarah Jenkins had escaped the monster, but she had brought a piece of the silence with her. Thorn returned to the precinct and retrieved the wooden box from the vault. He ran his glove over the intricate silver inlay, the map. he realized the map did not chart the history of the collector's victims, it charted the